In late August, Microsoft released Windows 95, replacing the previous version Windows 3.1. 95 represented a major upgrade, allowing much improved multitasking, file names of more than 8 characters, integrated device detection and configuration, plug and play as it was known, and a number of accessibility features, and it was also now an operating system in its own right rather than being installed as a sort of front end for DOS. The most immediately obvious change, however, was in the look of the desktop with the introduction of the Start button, programs showing up as tiles on the taskbar, Windows Explorer replacing the File Manager, and so on. But one notable absence in the early days was that Windows 95 did not include a web browser, nor the TCP/IP protocol used by most Internet applications at the time, something that was corrected with the first service pack, which included Internet Explorer. Middlesbrough Football Club moved into their new stadium, the Riverside Stadium, built on disused industrial land along the River Tees. The Taylor Report on the Hillsborough disaster, backed by legislation, had mandated all-seater stadiums, and Millwall's New Den Stadium in 1993 was the first to be purpose-built under the new rules, but the Riverside was the largest new stadium in England since the 1920s, and with Middlesbrough having just won promotion to the Premier League, it was the first in the top division. But not the last, as the late 1990s saw a lot of new stadiums being built, often replacing historic grounds that had been home to the clubs since the 1900s or even earlier, and were fondly thought of, but were also showing their age and not really suitable for upgrading, in line with the Taylor Report. And the Battle of Britpop was resolved as Blur's Country House, with its music video directed by Damien Hirst and starring Keith Allen, Matt Lucas and Joe Guest among others, pipped Oasis's Roll With It to the #1 spot in the singles chart by about 50,000 copies, which came as a surprise to many commentators. However, Oasis's album What's the Story Morning Glory, released in October 1995, would go on to be a massive hit both commercially and critically, and is still regarded as one of the best albums of the decade, so one could argue that Blur won the battle and Oasis won the war. The worst kept secret in Formula 1 was finally out a few days after the Hungarian Grand Prix, as Ferrari announced that Michael Schumacher would be joining the team for 1996 on a 2-year deal with an option for a third. Needless to say, details of the finances were not publicised, but Paddock Rumour put it at an eye-watering $60 million paid to Michael over the 2 seasons, bankrolled in part by Ferrari's new fuel partner Shell and Marlboro. Benetton likewise announced that Jean Alesi would be moving in the opposite direction, to the delight of Renault, who had been wanting a new French hero, and believed that with Alesi at Benetton they stood a real chance of a new French world champion. Jean had a generous if unspecified salary and, more importantly, #1 driver status, but the team would also have to work to keep some of their key staff, with Jean Todt apparently also targeting Rory Byrne and Ross Brawn to add to the team's British engineering contingent headed by John Barnard. On the same day as Ferrari's announcement, Williams announced that Damon Hill had signed a new 1-year deal, which would see him partner Jacques Villeneuve for 1996, with a pay rise to ensure that he was paid the same as the Canadian, allegedly $6 to $7 million for the year. It had been assumed that this would be quickly followed by McLaren announcing David Coulthard for 1996, and the young Scot had a contract in his hand, but Ron Dennis had a bombshell of his own to drop. Alain Prost would be testing the McLaren MP410 at Silverstone on the 10th of September, the day of the Italian Grand Prix. His manager, Julian Jacobi, had been negotiating with Dennis and Mansour Ojei for a month, and neither of them needed much convincing. Neither did Norbert Haug of Mercedes, nor Marlboro, despite having had their fingers burnt with one returning veteran recently. Prost, unlike Mansell, went way back as a McLaren driver, of course, but whether he wanted to dive back into the morass of F1 politics was another matter, given how he'd left things at the end of 1993. Despite his woes in Hungary, Michael Schumacher arrived in Belgium then in understandably buoyant mood, and with so many German fans crossing the border to follow him, his sponsor, the Bitburger Brewery, put on a beer festival in a meadow by the circuit on a sunny Thursday, with the man himself putting in an appearance to down a stein. Schumacher's hometown of Kerpen wasn't far from the Belgian border, and Michael had made his debut at Spa in 1991, won his first race here a year later, and would be keen this year to erase the memory of 1994, when he was disqualified for having a worn underfloor plank. His future employers Ferrari were not having a good time at all. Not only had development on the car stagnated, But the drivers were even unhappier than they had been so far. Alesi, who had always loved being a Ferrari driver, was smarting at having been cast aside in favour of Schumacher, and was now finding that as a lame duck driver he was not being included in technical discussions. The team was still hoping to keep Berger, but the Austrian was clear that he wasn't interested in being number 2 to Schumacher, saying he'd only stay at Ferrari on an equal contract with Michael, which obviously wasn't going to happen, and snidely commenting about how the German star was in for a culture shock with all the pressure and politics of Ferrari. There were other teams in trouble too. Bailiffs showed up on Friday morning and seized Pacific's equipment on behalf of Heini Mada. The team owed the Swiss engine tuner a significant sum for his work on their engines, and after some negotiations, an agreement was made whereby the payments were spread over 2 years, but secured against the personal assets of team co-owners Keith Wiggins and Bertrand Gachot. Even with the cash injection provided by Giovanni Lavaggi, things were not looking good for the team. And Ligier had a meeting on Saturday with representatives of Mugen Honda as they renegotiated their engine deal for another 2 years, though Giancarlo Minardi, Jackie Oliver and Guido Forti all made sure to say konnichiwa too. The latter had responded to Moreno's retirement in Hungary by introducing the flappy paddle gearbox system for the FG01, but aside from new rear suspensions for the Ferrari and McLaren cars, which had again dispensed with their mid-wings, there was not much in the way of significant car development as Friday qualifying began in monsoon conditions, the weather in the Ardennes unpredictable as ever. The ugly temporary chicane at Eau Rouge had been removed at least with the addition of extra runoff and gravel traps, so that famous corner was back to everyone's delight. Herbert had wrecked his Benetton in the morning warm-up, clobbering the concrete hard enough not to be able to remember much between driving the car and being in the medical centre, so he set out Friday's session, and it was Berger who set the fastest time around the historic circuit, ahead of Schumacher, Hill and Alesi. It looked like it would all come down to Saturday's session. Schumacher had an almighty crash at Les Combes in Saturday morning's warm-up, meaning his car wouldn't be ready for the start of qualifying, which saw a veritable queue of cars rushing to get out on a dry track in case the threatening clouds did indeed turn to rain. It did, and just 3 minutes after the session started, catching out several drivers as they skated around the track on slick tyres on their way back in to wait for it to stop again. The Ferraris had been out first and were currently in the top 2 spots, with Salo a great 6th ahead of Hill, while Schumacher hadn't made it out at all and was currently 17th in the standings based on Friday's time. The rain stopped again and Moreno was the first out, followed by Schumacher, who really needed to set a time, but on the still damp circuit he couldn't get much closer to Berger's pole time before a gearbox failure ended his session prematurely. The rest did their best, but nobody was getting near to Berger's time set on a dry track, and so the Austrian would start the race from pole, a fine present for his 36th birthday, with Alesi alongside. Hakkinen was third, another one who'd got a good time in early and equalled his best ever grid slot, with Herbert putting in a great lap to take fourth, and incidentally become the first teammate to outqualify Schumacher since Nelson Piquet at Adelaide in 1991. Coulthard was the faster of the 2 Williamses in 5th alongside Mark Blundell, with Irvine and Hill on row 4, Damon stuffing it in a barrier late on in an attempt to go faster, then Panis and Frentzen making up the top 10. Salo's 6th place turned into 11th in the end, but he was still happy enough to start ahead of Barrichello and Brundle, with Katayama 15th and lining up just ahead of Michael Schumacher, who would start the race from 16th place, very far from ideal and his worst ever grid slot. Behind him, the remaining 8 places were divided, as usual, between the Minardi, Footwork, Pacific and Forti teams. So while Ferrari were happy with an unexpected front row lockout, Damon Hill had mixed feelings. 8th place wasn't great, but it was still 8 places ahead of his title rival, who could quite easily find himself involved in a midfield altercation, especially if it was a wet race. So both title contenders were way back in the pack, and their number 2s were ahead of them, as was Blundell and Berger, all out of their teams for 1996 and looking to impress, so it was shaping up to be a very interesting race. Sunday morning's warm-up took place in a downpour, and Alesi went fastest, but Hill and Schumacher both set out their stalls in 2nd and 3rd respectively. But by the time the TV crews were doing their grid interviews, it had dried out again, and the team strategists mostly decided to go with dry settings for the wings and start on slicks, but it didn't take a meteorologist to see that rain was on the cards for later in the afternoon. Alesi's spark plugs were giving him trouble again, and he would line up in the spare Ferrari, but otherwise there was a trouble-free formation lap and they were ready to go. The green light shone, Berger lit up his tyres and slithered, nearly collecting Hakkinen, as Alesi and Herbert shot past, charging side by side down towards Eau Rouge as everyone got through La Source unscathed. Alesi had the line into the famous corner though and held the lead, but Johnny was not to be denied, pulling out from behind Alesi as they braked for Les Combes, taking the lead, while Berger still had Hakkinen all over the back of him. Hill had come up past Irvine and Blundell to 6th, while Schumacher, after narrowly avoiding contact with Katayama off the line, had passed the Japanese driver as well as Bouillon and a slow-starting Salo and was up to 13th, which became 12th as he passed Barrichello on the line at the end of the first lap. They all streamed past Hakkinen, who'd spun at La Source, nearly collecting Coulthard and then stalled, and as he walked away shaking his head, Alesi retook the lead from Herbert at Les Combes, with Berger looking to get by too. Schumacher had now passed Frentzen for 11th, then moved up to 10th thanks to Hakkinen's error, while Berger had not only dropped back from Herbert but was under attack from Coulthard, who got past her at La Source at the start of lap 4. While Schumacher went past both Ligiers to go up to 8th, and Hill also passed a clearly struggling Berger. It was all going wrong for Ferrari, as Alesi pulled in at the end of the lap feeling a puncture on his left front, to the evident surprise of the pit crew, but on exiting the pit lane it became clear that the actual problem was a broken wishbone and he was out. So, Herbert was back in the lead, but now with Coulthard and Hill looming large in his mirrors, just as the first drops of rain started to fall. Coulthard was climbing all over the back of Herbert, who slammed the door on him at La Source. But just as Johnny had done to Jean Alesi earlier on, Coulthard kept the pressure on all the way up to Kemmel, and as they went into Les Combes, Herbert stayed off the brake just that bit too long and spun into the grass, righting his car and rejoining third with Berger now behind him. Under pressure from the Austrian and with his tyres still covered in dirt from his excursion, Herbert then spun again at the bus stop, ending up pointing the wrong way and nearly collecting Blundell, who had to come to a full stop to avoid him. Both got going again, but not before Schumacher had come past, having thus made it up to 5th place, with Irvine and Berger his next targets. It was still only lap 7, and Coulthard led Hill by 2 seconds, with Berger, Irvine and Schumacher another 8 seconds back, then Herbert 6th, with Panis, Blundell, Brundle and Barrichello making up the top 10. Irvine was proving more of an obstacle to Schumacher than anyone else had so far, and stayed ahead for another 4 laps before the German bushwhacked him going into bus stop for 4th place. By then it was already getting into the pit window for anyone on a 2-stop strategy, and Barrichello was first in on lap 13, just as Coulthard slowed dramatically, his gearbox having seized solid with an oil leak, and he pulled off, which put Hill up into the lead, with Berger now 2nd, and Schumacher 3rd, running together, as Herbert came in from 5th. Schumacher was still looking for a way past Berger, but it looked inevitable that he'd be passed before long. Hill was in on lap 15, and as he left, Berger and Irvine came in from 3rd and 4th, all of which put Schumacher into the lead, though he still needed to make a stop. The Ligiers, who also hadn't stopped yet, had made their way up to 3rd and 4th and were running close together, with the also yet to stop Frentzen behind in 5th. Schumacher was in turn on lap 19, putting Hill back in the lead, but he was out still 2nd, well ahead of the Ligiers, while Barrichello was in for a second time to have a loose seatbelt retightened. In a 44-lap race, 19 was a bit early for a 1-stop, but quite late for a 2, but the short stop suggested that Schumacher was doing 2, while Frentzen was in a lap later for his 1-stop. That would have put Berger back up to 5th, but the Ferrari's engine started spluttering, and he came in to have his engine control unit changed. Just then, it started raining in earnest, at least across the middle of the circuit between Raidillon and Blanchimont. Hill came in on lap 21 to put wet tyres on, so Schumacher went through into the lead, but was slithering around on slick tyres and would presumably need to come in himself. As everyone started coming into wets, and Max Papis wished he had, spinning on the pit straight, Irvine's fuel filler cap didn't close properly, splashing fuel around which caught fire, mostly missed by the cameras, though they did spot the smoke, and Johnny Herbert nearly mowing down a couple of Jordan pit crew as they stepped back from the fire, which was out in seconds with nobody hurt. Hill, meanwhile, had eaten up the distance on his wet tyres and arrived on Schumacher's rear wing, having been lapping 6 seconds quicker, but the German was determined not to let him through, blocking him at Raidillon, then toughing it out into Les Combes and forcing Damon onto the curbs, and for the rest of that lap Hill just could not get past, as Schumacher stuck doggedly to his line, making Hill go the long way round, changing his line no fewer than 5 times between Stavelot and the bus stop to end the lap still in the lead. It was great stuff to watch for the neutrals, and next time out at Les Combes, Hill made it stick and sent Schumacher bouncing across the grass, but the rain had already stopped. It only took a lap for the track to dry sufficiently that now Hill was the one on unsuitable tyres, as Badoer bounced across the gravel, having got it all wrong trying to pass his teammate Lamy, and soon Schumacher was right back up with Hill. Meanwhile, Berger trickled back in to retire, his engine still not right, meaning for the first time this season neither of the Ferraris would see the finish, having scored points at every race up to now. Schumacher got past Hill at Stavelot, while the cameras were watching the Ligiers, still 3rd and 4th, catching up with the leaders just in time to see Hill slithering around at the entrance to the bus stop. Schumacher crossed the line as far ahead of Hill as Hill had been ahead of him last time around. Williams, realising their gamble had failed, brought Hill in on lap 26 to switch back to slicks, with Panis following suit and returning to the track behind Herbert and Katayama, who'd quietly been progressing up the field. Blundell, another one on wets, had been passed by both Tyrrells and came in to switch to slicks, as did Bouillon and Lavaggi, but just then it started raining again, the Benetton team reacting quickly enough to put a new set of wets on Herbert when he came in for his planned second stop. No Jordan mechanics in the way this time. So, on lap 28 of the 44, Schumacher led Hill by 29 seconds, with Brundle third nearly a minute behind the Williams. Katayama up to a fantastic 4th, with Panis and Salo making up the top 6, then Herbert and Barrichello, as McLaren brought Blundell back in for wets. But with the rain really coming down now and the majority of the field still on slicks, the safety car was deployed. But too late for the unfortunate Katayama, who aquaplaned off at Malmedy and destroyed the front of his Tyrrell. While the safety car circulated, Schumacher, Hill and most of the rest came back in for wet tyres, then worked their way back to their positions behind the Porsche. By lap 32 the rain had stopped, though the track was still wet, and the lights on the safety car went out. The safety car had actually worked in Hill's favour by erasing the gap to Schumacher, but he wouldn't be able to attack as soon as the race restarted because a lapped Moreno had ended up between them. Damon had to go the long way round at La Source when the green flag was waved, as Moreno nearly lost the back end, and then Panis did lose it, recovering well but losing places to Barrichello and Salo. Herbert also got wide and likewise lost out to Frentzen and Blundell. And then, dramatically, Hill was given a 10-second stop-go penalty for speeding in the pit lane, which pretty much ended the race as a contest, putting Hill back out on the track, third behind Brundle, only to spin at La Source at the start of lap 35 in his frustration. But he soon recovered and put his foot down, his tyres 16 laps newer than Martin's, and before long Hill was quickly eating up the distance at the rate of 2 seconds a lap as a dry line began to emerge once more. With just 6 laps to go now, there was no point in switching back onto slicks again, so everyone was trying to eke out their wet tyres to the end of the race. Brundle was doing his best, seeking out wet parts of the track to cool his tyres, while behind him his near-namesake Blundell was fighting to keep 4th place from a very feisty Frentzen. Finally, the Sauber got through on lap 41. With 2 laps to go, Hill was right with Brundle, taking a look at the bus stop as Schumacher began his last lap. At La Source at the start of the last lap, Brundle got a bit sideways, but Hill lost grip and skidded too, but then held on to stay in the Ligiers slipstream, and then going up Kemmel, a combination of superior Renault power and Brundle's shot tyres allowed Hill to retake 2nd place without in the end too much drama. Nothing stopped Schumacher though, taking his 16th career win from 16th on the grid, coming home to take the win after a superb wet weather drive, with Hill 2nd and Brundle taking Ligier's first podium of the year in 3rd. Frentzen and Blundell both kept it on the island to finish 4th and 5th, with Barrichello 6th, and Herbert ending up just out of the points in 7th place. There were words at the trackside between Hill and Schumacher, the former unhappy with the latter's blocking of him earlier in the race, but the arrival of Brundle seemed to defuse any tensions as he was warmly welcomed by both. An overjoyed Schumacher and a pensive Hill took to the podium alongside a pretty satisfied Brundle. In the press conference afterwards, Hill said that he was
not satisfied with being driven into.
Apparently he and Schumacher had banged wheels on the way out of Raidillon on lap 23 as he tried to get past. An hour later, the Williams team lodged a protest against Schumacher for dangerous driving, which he naturally denied, But on reviewing the video evidence, he agreed that he had been out of line and offered Damon his profuse apologies, getting away with a one-race ban suspended for 4 races. Opinion, even within the stewards, seemed to be divided as to whether Schumacher's holding off of Hill on slick tyres had been incredibly skillful or incredibly dangerous. "There are limits to everything, even virtuosity," remarked one official. So, a good day for Schumacher and Benetton, who extended the leads in their respective championships, and a great day for Ligier, who went up to 4th in the Constructors, though both Panis and boss Tom Walkinshaw were unhappy that Olivier's spin had cost them a potential 2 or 3 more points. But that wouldn't spoil the party at Magny-Cours, as the teams prepared for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza in 2 weeks' time.